the Lithuanian Metrica.
Eight-year-old Mykolas carefully and slowly learns his alphabet. His father gazes at his son and thinks, good that he's learning, and slowly learning to read. Perhaps he'll become a scribe. Several hundred years ago, being a scribe in Lithuania promised a solid, if not lavish, way of life. Scribes were needed for the ruler's chancellery, and they were also employed on the estates of wealthy nobles. Scribes are the ones who wrote up all the historical documents, in the process creating what we now call the Lithuanian Metrica, the principal archive of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And although this archive, consisting of about 600 books, has been held in Russia for more than 200 years, Lithuanian historians have had access to the documents contained there with the help of microfilm copies. These days, archives are fairly accessible institutions. All you need to do is register and then search for whatever your heart desires, say for distant relatives or material for a dissertation. 400 years ago, things were very different. First of all, no average John or Peter would have been allowed to get near such documents. Secondly, back then, old documents were not much of interest to the average John or Peter anyway. If you were a nobleman, however, your interests were a bit different. Sooner or later, you'd have to convince a court that your family had been in possession of its title for 2 centuries, and that you were the rightful owner of your estate and 3 surrounding villages. In other words, you'd need the right documents. Thus, a scribe once again appears on our stage, and not just any scribe, but one we might call a detective scribe. You see, back then, noblemen didn't waste their own time digging through old papers. They hired an educated professional instead. In their search for documents about privileges and other official acts, scribes had to request access to the palace of the Grand Dukes. There, in the treasury, was stored the great majority of old Lithuanian documents. But not always there, because some of the more recent books of the Lithuanian Metrica were then being held by the residents of Vilnius. Not by your average residents, of course, but by the rich and well-to-do, by people able to purchase a solid masonry home on City Hall Square or nearby, and always with a cellar where documents could be kept. We know for certain that there are at least 6 such houses in Vilnius. 3 of these survive to this day. Interestingly, some of them sometimes house the offices of the ruler's chancellery. 2 of them also once served as alcohol distilleries. What was the point in transforming your home into a storage facility and assuming all that responsibility, you ask? A payoff, of course, but of a rather peculiar sort. You see, in those days, any Vilnius inhabitant who owned their own residence was required to provide accommodation to the city's guests, from noblemen to court musicians. But if you were housing several chests full of Lithuanian Metrica books, the obligation to receive guests no longer applied to you. To be sure, some guests simply ignored the law. The treasurer of the province of Trakai, Kazimierz Nietzszewski, and his wife occupied an entire 3-story home on what is today DeJoy Street. Somewhat later, the home's owner testified in court that they dared to occupy my home by force, breaking down the doors to the rooms and cellars, appropriating the chests holding books and the Metrica, and taking all sorts of other things. How do you think we know all this today? Because Mykolas, that 8-year-old boy who so diligently learned his letters, actually did become a scribe and co-author of the Lithuanian Metrica.